Hello, everybody. My name is Parth Joshi. I am a master's student at Purdue University studying computer and information technology. And this is my project about how value orientations and technical skills combine within the computing education space. So it's called Beyond Technical Skills, How Value Orientations Shape Computing Student Team Success. So, within computer education and computing education, classrooms that teach like machine learning, artificial intelligence, general just computing, there's a lot of group projects. And we assign these group projects often because that is the standard learning practice. They mirror how software development and research is in the real world, and they're very, very useful for preparing students for industry standards. So many companies, top companies, Apple, Google, they all have projects and teams that work on those projects. However, these teams they may not know each other, but they have to come together and solve a common goal. But why do some teams thrive while others struggle? So the traditional approach sometimes falls short. The current approach for team formation is to try to balance technical skill levels among all of the teams in your class, try to distribute the strong students across the teams, and then kind of hope for the best. There isn't like a way for, you know, you to make teams besides either random assignment or having the teams pick themselves. But what's missing, right, in these approaches? It's that students themselves bring different beliefs about how teams should work, right? What they think a good team looks like. And that's the missing factor. And so the research questions for this kind of try to address that, right, in two ways. So the first one is value orientation. So how do value orientations influence collaboration? So for example, and I'll talk about it more, different people have different values that they value within teamwork. For example, some people value meritocracy, some people value equity, and those things reflect in how we ourselves work within teams, right? So these are beliefs about teamwork, communication, authority, and time management. The second is how do technical expertise disparities interact with these orientations? So how do gaps in technical skills or different people knowing different technical skills interact with these orientation? And that influences things like knowledge sharing and role distribution throughout the projects. This is kind of the theoretical framework and the two facets of what I'm looking at. The first is the spectrum of value orientations, right? So we have an individualist type of value orientation. So they prefer autonomy, personal achievement, and independence, whereas you have a collectivist value orientation. So they prefer group harmony, shared success, and interdependence, right? And then on the technical expertise side, we know that it's very, very inevitable for there to be groups that have unequal technical expertise. For example, in my own personal life, I've been in a group where one person is like really, really good at coding and the other person has no coding experience, right? And that's just how it's going to be when you're teaching a highly technical skill. And so complementary strengths or isolating barriers. Basically, are differences in technical expertise a strength or an isolating barrier for your project success? And so the study we had was a mixed methods case study with four interdisciplinary graduate student teams. And they were working on semester-long biomedical modeling projects. This is important because they are kind of combining their expertise in biology with like computational thinking, creating models, machine learning, algorithms, things like that. So it's a combination of science, right, and computing. And different students within these projects had different levels of computing knowledge and like biology knowledge, which makes it very interesting, right? And the way we collected data was in two ways. So the first, we had at the end of when other projects were done, we had semi-structured interviews with each of the teams talking about their processes, their like values that they shared, how their project went, were they satisfied, questions like that. And then at the beginning of the project, we had a value orientation survey, basically gauging each student's affinity towards things like independence versus collaboration, meritocracy versus ascription, those like team or value orientations. And so the analysis we had was a reflexive thematic analysis on the qualitative data, which is from the semi-structured interviews. And then we had a descriptive statistics analysis done on the value orientation surveys. So the survey, the values were ranked from 1 to 8 on a Likert scale for each of these values, like independence, meritocracy, ascription, cooperation, things like that. And so the teams themselves, they varied, right? So we had balanced teams, we had teams that had very individualism dominant, and we had very collectivist dominant teams. So kind of a varied amount. And then we had teams with very clear experts in specific subject areas, and we had teams with kind of distributed knowledge of areas. So this gave us a good kind of feel for how different situations would play out with people who have balanced teams but clear experts within technical expertise, or imbalanced teams, and then teams who also had distributed knowledge. So a variety of situations. And we were kind of observing the interaction between how these factors work together and determined the outcomes. So the first finding we had was that collectivist themes, they do well, right? So if you have a balanced and collectivist team, that usually leads to strong team cohesion. They were able to develop shared mental models of their problems together. They frequently checked in with each other and were able to make adjustments throughout their project. And they had a lot of implicit coordination, which is where you are working with your teammate and you can kind of predict what help they may need, right? And so any problems that they went through, they were treated as a collective challenge rather than an individual problem like, oh, you do it. A good quote we had from that was, we started finishing each other's sentences during coding sessions. So they kind of put themselves in their teammates' shoes and were able to work together to tackle their problems. The second finding was that individualist teams tend to struggle. So these like individualism dominant teams, they tended to have distant relationships with each other, which kind of led to issues with collaboration and problem solving. One difference between the teams that were more like team oriented versus individualistic oriented was the fact that the individual teams, even though they were working together, it was parallel work rather than collaboration. So everyone was still kind of siloed in their own areas, but they were, working together, but we did not call this collaboration. They had early task division and then independent execution of their tasks. For example, they're like, oh, one person, you focus on the writing and the research portion, I will do the modeling, and then the third person can work on, bringing those two together in the final product, right? And so that's different from some of the other teams where they were like all working together on each, individual element. Some of the meetings that they had were only for updates rather than collaboration sessions, and their work together seemed a little more like segmented and, separated. There was like a limited integration between the different things people did. So, this was a more like professional type of setting, but it was not truly collaborative. The third finding we had was that communication directness was super critical in how the knowledge was transferred. So collectivist teams, they were very comfortable asking basic questions, maybe, the stupid questions in a project. They were very quickly admitting when they had gaps in the knowledge, and they were welcoming of those because they took those as teachable moments, right? Where you could teach other people about things that you know. Overall, we kind of realized that they had a pretty high psychological safety when they were doing their work. As opposed to individualist teams, they were kind of reluctant to let their team know what they knew and what they didn't know. And this kind of led each of the teams to have like an incomplete picture of what their strengths were and what their weaknesses were. This kind of maybe was due to a fear of appearing incompetent. And there were very like silent knowledge gaps. So people, even if they didn't know what they were doing, they didn't tell anybody or ask for help, which led to at times subpar work. So here is something that we thought was really interesting. So the combination between expertise and collectivism led to greater learning outcomes. So even though there were technical gaps within these teams, if you had a collectivist team, that technical gap turned into complementary strengths. So the experts came out in the specific areas that they needed to come out in and naturally mentored the students that were maybe less skilled in those areas. Um, and they did that by more thoroughly documenting the way they thought about the problems and the way they tackled the problem. For example, there was a student who was very, very excellent at modeling biological processes, but they didn't really understand the actual science behind the biological process, right? So they were able to create the model, but they didn't know what they were modeling. And so there was another student who was an expert at biology, and these students came together and were able to, equally be experts in their two areas, but also share a bunch of knowledge with each other to create a more holistically better project. One thing that these kind of teams did was actively check with each other for understanding. Like, oh, do you understand that? Are you sure? And then the person on the responding end, they were very willing to either express that they knew something or express that they didn't know something. And this led to the less experienced members asking questions more freely, right? And overall, this led to more enhanced learning for all of the members of the team. So when there was expertise gaps and individualism, this led to silos within the team itself, right? So these technical gaps kind of formed isolating barriers between team members. So experts in these cases became bottlenecks where all of the work for that specific topic had to go through them. It couldn't go any other way. And that led to, time constraints being pushed, and overall unsatisfaction with, I had to do so much work, like you barely did any work, things like that, right? And there was no process for knowledge sharing or knowledge building between teammates. The less experienced members in these teams struggled or kind of remained passive and didn't do a lot of work because they didn't have the knowledge and weren't learning the knowledge to do the work they were supposed to do. And there was a growing distance in the relationship. So a quote we had was from one of the less experienced members. They said, "I felt like a spectator in my own project," which is quite frankly really sad. So last finding we had was that values drive role distribution. So how the work is actually divided reveals the orientation of the team. So collectivist teams, they were very confident with rotating responsibilities, even when a non-expert was working on that task. They were always willing to cross-train each other within their expertise. And when there was a problem or crises, they collectively mobilized and worked together to tackle that, right? Whereas individualistic teams, they had fixed specialized roles that didn't change throughout the process of the project. They didn't switch with each other. They kind of stayed the same. And so this kind of resulted in role ownership, or rather like role guarding, where this is my area, no one can come here, I will do it myself, right? And then when there was a crisis, because they were already so divided, the response was, that's not my problem, that's not my task. And so these are the practical implications for like this project in general. And there are a couple, right? The first is for team formation, right? As an instructor and trying to form teams, you want to assess more than just technical skills. If your teams aren't random, if you're trying to intentionally, have students have the best outcomes from their project, you need to assess more than technical skills. So use brief value orientation surveys during the team formation. You need to identify people who are more individual dominant, and recognize that these teams need different supports. So individualistic teams need different supports and collectivist teams need different supports. And you're not trying to aim for balance, you're trying to aim for awareness. So what that means is having the students share with each other what their preferences are, right? Because if I know that my teammate is very individualistic and has a hard time, actively sharing knowledge on their own, then me as a teammate would be like, oh, I know this. I will try to communicate with them more and try to learn by asking a bunch of questions, because I know that they're not going to share with me on their own, right? And so a tool they can use is a quick like 5 to 10 question survey on any learning management system where you can rank your, tendencies on a bunch of different value domains. Some early warning signs to look out for would be to the immediate siloing into specialized roles. If you see team members who are immediately like, oh, I'm good at coding, I will do all of the coding. I'm good at research, I will do all of the, literature review. This is a warning sign for maybe unsatisfactory outcomes in the future. You want the team members to work on these projects together, not separately. Um, what another red flag that we saw was reluctance to meet synchronously. So having all their work done asynchronously and then maybe doing like a quick check-in. This leads to the same kind of thing where people are just working on their own. They're not really collaborating. And that leads to communication through only formal updates. You want some sort of informal communication flow, because that, increases the amount of communication and the amount of teamwork between team members. And the last part is no intentional or no knowledge sharing discussion at all, which leads to just dissatisfaction after the project because you feel like you didn't learn anything. And a lot of these patterns were practical. In the teams that we studied, like we were able to catch these and, really zero in on how those impacted the outcomes of the project. Another practical implication is targeted support, right? So as I said, individualistic teams need specific supports and collectivist teams need specific supports, right? For individualistic teams, they need structure in terms of teamwork, right? So maybe you want to require pair programming sessions, or you want them to document their expectations for learning and sharing at the beginning of their project, right? You need to create mandatory structured processes for them to work together and collaborate. On the other opposite of the spectrum, collectivist teams, they need additional clarity, right? So they all want to work together, but in what way? How will they work together, right? So for that, you need clear definitions of roles. So who is good at what? Who is going to kind of take the lead on what things, right? And then you need to hold accountability. So if something doesn't happen, what's going to happen? And so that mainly is there to prevent the diffusion of responsibility. If everybody's doing everything at once, then maybe nothing will get done, right? So you want there to be some sort of responsibility within that teamwork structure. So, all this is to, try to create inclusive environments, especially culturally, right? Value orientations, they heavily correlate with Hofstadter's cultural orientations, and those, relate to cultural backgrounds. So, collectivist approaches often align with students from traditionally like underrepresented cultures, non-Western educational backgrounds, or community-oriented value systems. And then individualistic orientations often correlate with more Western values. And so by supporting collectivist approaches, we are creating more inclusive learning environments for people who do want to work in teams and do want to, communicate with everybody. And so the key takeaway here is that a technical skill balance within team formation is not sufficient by itself. You need further assessment and further understanding of things like value orientations, the actual distribution of technical expertise, and how these things interact with each other for effective team composition. And so that specific interaction, it determines whether expertise gaps become either learning opportunities for team members or barriers and isolating factors for team members. And so, in just a broader significance of this project, within computing education, we need to move past the idea of just group them together and, hope they'll figure it out. Professional work requires navigating these diverse value orientations, and so your school work and school teams should, represent reality in that same way. And then for individuals, like individual students, they need to understand that teams are complex systems. The goal of a team, yes, it is to, complete the project, but it also is to learn something. It is to maybe create relationships with the people on that team. And so you need to take a look at either your individual beliefs that you have and your capabilities and how those, create predictable patterns within the teams that you're in. If you do understand these, then you're better yourself at forming teams, diagnosing teams, and supporting teams in general. So overall, student teams, they can be a predictable system if you follow and look through a couple extra variables. So you want to form better teams through some sort of value assessment to understand what they prefer and don't prefer. This allows you to diagnose problems more accurately, provide appropriate, more targeted support, and overall prepare students for more interdisciplinary collaboration in the future. Thank you.